See not what men say, but what they do and what they become by doing it. Citizens of reason, seekers of virtue. Let us speak not of the loud, the rebellious, the defiant. Let us speak instead of the quiet ones. The ones who bow the head without question, who follow without pause, who obey not from wisdom, but from habit. Ask yourself, what is obedience, when it is divorced from judgment? It is not virtue. It is not discipline. It is submission. And where men submit without thought, there lies the seed of great harm. The sword in the hand of the tyrant is not his own, it is placed there by the hands of those who simply followed orders. Obedient men, without reason, become the tools of ambition, the silent architects of ruin. They build tyrannies brick by brick, not through evil, but through indifference. He who obeys without examining the command betrays the logos of the divine reason within. Such a man does not live in accordance with nature, but in accordance with fear. And fear is never a guide to virtue. Think, was it not the obedient who filled the arenas, cheering as justice was torn apart? Was it not the obedient who signed parchments of exile, imprisonment, and war? A man must follow his own soul, his reasoned soul, and not the voice of the crowd, not the decrees of the power-hungry, not the customs of the age. For what is customary is not always right, and what is legal is not always just. Better to stand alone in truth than march with the many into error. You were not born to obey. You were born to act rightly. You were born to think, to discern, to weigh the good against the convenient, and the just against the easy. So beware the obedient man who has silenced his reason, for he is no longer a citizen, but a shadow. And when shadows grow long, the world grows dark. Let the obedient awaken. Let them remember, it is not the command, but the conscience, that must be followed. And let those who rule remember this also, for when obedience becomes blind, leadership becomes tyranny. Greater than do not waste what remains of your life in speculating about others. A broken bar. Direct your effort only toward what nature demands, to stand upright, to speak the truth, and to act justly. This is the way. Walk it with your eyes open. Obedience without judgment is submission, not virtue. It is a subtle transformation of the soul from active participant in life to passive instrument of another's will. When a person ceases to question, to evaluate, and to apply reason to what he is told, he becomes something less than a citizen. He becomes a vessel for the commands of others. In this state, he may still appear orderly, loyal, even righteous, but he has traded the essence of moral responsibility for the ease of compliance. And herein lies the danger, for an unthinking obedient man can become a silent partner in destruction. Throughout history, it has rarely been the rebellious who carried out the greatest injustices. It has been the disciplined, the rule followers, the ones who only did what they were told. They do not shout, but they obey. They do not resist, but they execute. Orders pass through them like wind through hollow reeds. Without judgment or temper action, obedience becomes a force indifferent to good and evil. And what is more dangerous than a person who moves without understanding the purpose of his movement? A person trained to obey without reflection becomes desensitized to consequence. He does not feel the weight of the outcomes he causes. He has learned to silence the inner voice of conscience and replaced it with the outer voice of authority. If the order is legal, he assumes it is right. If it is delivered by a superior, he assumes it is wise. This is how atrocities are born, and not from hatred alone, but from the absence of scrutiny in those who carry out commands. When obedience is demanded as a virtue in itself, apart from wisdom, it becomes a threat to the moral fabric of society. It allows individuals to dissociate from their actions. They no longer see themselves as moral agents, responsible for their choices, but as mere links in a chain. The obedient become the machinery through which the unjust wield their power. They load the carts, sign the papers, enforce the rules, and turn the key in the lock. They do all this while believing themselves innocent, because they did not design the destination, or they only walked the path laid out before them. This is why obedient people, when divorced from judgment, become dangerous. They act with the force of conviction but without the burden of thought. They carry out what is asked without the pause of reflection. And often, Their very obedience gives legitimacy to wrongdoers. The tyrant alone is only a man. But with an army of the obedient, he becomes a force. The obedient do not ask whether the action is just, they ask only if it is permitted. They do not ask whether the order is wise, they ask only who gave it. It is not the disobedient who need the most scrutiny, it is the obedient. Because when they abandon judgment, they surrender the last defense against evil clothed in protocol. Thoughtless obedience enables tyranny and injustice. When people surrender their capacity to question, they become the silent builders of systems that oppress, destroy, and deceive. Tyranny is not born from the will of one alone, but from the many who support it with their silence, their labor, and their obedience. It rises not because evil is strong, but because good men obey without thinking. The obedient may not intend harm, yet their failure to reflect makes them the very instruments of harm. The tyrant does not need an army of monsters. He needs ordinary people who will follow instructions without pause, who will value rules over conscience and order over justice. He needs those who believe their only duty is to comply, not to understand. When such people multiply, the walls of injustice are built not by force, but by routine. Every unchecked command, every unexamined duty, becomes another stone laid in the foundation of oppression. It is the obedience of the masses that gives the tyrant his power. When individuals abandon critical thought, they sever the link between action and ethics. They no longer ask whether something is right, only whether it is required. And when a person ceases to ask why, they become dangerous, not because they desire evil, but because they no longer recognize it. Their conscience, once active, becomes dormant. They delegate moral responsibility to those above them and justify their deeds by pointing to hierarchy and structure. But hierarchy does not absolve, and structure does not sanctify justice. In such a climate, injustice wears a uniform and speaks informal language. It walks through courts, offices, and institutions not with violence, but with authority. The obedient ensure its smooth passage. They guard the gates, stamp the documents, and carry out the laws without a flicker of resistance. If a man is imprisoned unjustly, it is not only the one who condemned him who is guilty, it is also the clerk who filed the papers, the guard who locked the door, and the officer who transported him. Each claimed they were just doing their job, and yet each enabled the wrong. This is why thoughtless obedience is more dangerous than open rebellion. The rebel exposes himself. He declares his intentions, for better or worse. But the obedient hide behind neutrality. They appear harmless, even virtuous, yet their actions sustain and protect systems that breed suffering. Their hands carry out injustice while their minds remain distant. They see themselves as separate from outcomes, as if morality can be outsourced to authority. A society of obedient people becomes brittle, unthinking, and vulnerable to domination. Tyranny does not need to fight such people, it only needs to direct them. Without resistance, without reflection, they march under any banner, speak any slogan, enforce any law. They become the machinery of oppression, not because they chose evil, but because they chose nothing at all. They followed, and in following, they made space for the tyrant to lead. Fear-driven compliance silence is the rational soul. It takes from a person the most divine gift they possess, the ability to think, to discern, to weigh right against wrong, and to act accordingly. When fear becomes the motivator for obedience, the individual no longer lives by principle but by survival. And when survival governs behavior, conscience is pushed aside, buried beneath the pressure to conform and the dread of punishment. The danger of such obedience is not only that it is blind, but that it is desperate, and desperation breeds cruelty without intent, violence without reflection. A man who obeys out of fear is not in control of his own judgment. He is a mirror, reflecting the demands of power, not the clarity of reason. He does what he is told not because it is right, but because he fears the consequence of disobedience. This fear may come in many forms: fear of punishment, fear of isolation, fear of losing position, or simply the fear of uncertainty. But regardless of its shape, it has the same effect: it numbs the inner voice of reason, suppresses doubt, and replaces moral thought with mechanical reaction. Such a man is not only dangerous to others, he is dangerous to himself, for he lives in a state of constant denial. He must convince himself that he is not responsible, that the decision was not his, that he had no choice. In doing so, he kills the rational soul by degrees. With each command followed against better judgment, he becomes less capable of judging at all. Fear teaches him not to see, not to hear, not to question. And soon, he begins to believe that obedience itself is a virtue, even when it leads to suffering. Those who rule unjustly rely on fear to create obedient subjects. They understand that fear erodes resistance far more efficiently than force. A person beaten may rise in defiance, but a person made afraid will kneel willingly. The fearful obedient do not resist tyranny, they reinforce it. They enforce policies they do not agree with, speak lies they know are false, and turn against neighbors they once trusted, all in the name of compliance. They become instruments of oppression not by belief, but by fear of stepping out of line. The tragedy is that fear-driven obedience often wears the mask of civility. These individuals may appear respectful, orderly, and loyal. But beneath that surface lies a hollowed-out soul, one that has surrendered the sacred duty to think and act with moral courage. And because they have silenced their rational selves, they cannot distinguish between serving the good and serving evil. They carry out both with equal efficiency, provided the command is clear and the consequences are avoided. This kind of obedience is the foundation upon which systemic injustice is built. Not by malice, but by fear. Not by hatred, but by silence. And the more people who choose fear over thought, the more secure a tyrant becomes, not through force of arms, but through the quiet, unquestioning compliance of those who have forgotten how to say number. Custom and law are not always aligned with justice. What is accepted by society and sanctioned by law is often mistaken for what is right, yet history has shown that some of the most grievous wrongs have been committed under the full protection of both tradition and legislation. When people obey customs and laws without questioning their morality, they become agents of injustice wrapped in the cloak of legitimacy. Their actions are not guided by conscience, but by precedent and decree. And in this submission to the established order, danger arises not from evil intent, but from moral blindness. Obedient people often believe that by following law, they are absolved of personal responsibility. If the law says it, they assume it must be right. If custom approves it, they believe it is harmless. But justice does not always live within the lines of written codes or cultural norms. Justice is rooted in the reasoned soul, in the capacity to distinguish fairness from tyranny, and good from harm, even when the world says otherwise. Those who obey without applying that judgment become capable of perpetuating great harm with a clean conscience. A society that elevates law above morality risks turning citizens into unthinking tools. The obedient enforce rules that punish the innocent, silence the weak, and reward the cruel, not because they desire such outcomes, but because the law told them to. They will evict the helpless, arrest the peaceful, and destroy lives while insisting they are just doing their duty. The true danger lies in that phrase, for it signals the moment when the individual surrenders their moral compass to the machinery of the state or the habits of the culture. Custom often lags behind justice. Many practices that were once common as slavery, segregation, denial of rights were widely accepted and even praised in their time. Those who opposed them were labeled as dangerous, disobedient, and unpatriotic. But those who upheld them, who enforced them, who obeyed them, those were the ones who made injustice powerful. Their obedience gave tradition its weight and the cruelty its reach. And they did so not with hatred, but with the belief that they were simply preserving order. When people prioritize law and custom over justice, they learn to obey rules instead of reflect on them. They measure right and wrong not by truth, but by permission. This is what makes the obedient dangerous. They act without reflection, uphold the unjust with discipline, and enforce cruelty with efficiency. Their hands carry out the will of flawed systems, and their minds remain untouched by the suffering they cause. In such people, the difference between lawful and just disappears, and injustice flourishes behind a mask of righteousness. It is easy to punish the rebel. It is harder to confront the obedient who, through their unwavering loyalty to law and tradition, strengthen the foundations of oppression. They do not question, they do not hesitate, and they do not resist. Instead, they comply. And in that compliance, they become the very pillars that hold injustice in place, convinced that their obedience is a virtue, when in truth, it is the quiet engine of harm. True duty is to conscience, not command. A person's highest obligation is not to the voice that orders, but to the voice within that discerns. When people forget this, when they allow command to replace conscience as the source of their decisions, they surrender the core of their humanity. Obedience, when divorced from moral awareness, becomes a path to destruction. This is why obedient people, when unanchored from conscience, become dangerous, so they perform acts without reflection, carry out orders without question, and abandon responsibility while believing they are simply following duty. Commands can be given by any authority, military, political, religious, or social. But not every command is righteous. Not every order is just. To obey simply because one is told to do so is to betray the reasoned soul. It is to place one's judgment in the hands of another, often someone whose interests may not be aligned with truth or justice. History is filled with examples of individuals who committed terrible acts under the justification that they were only following orders. Yet the consequence of their actions was no less tragic simply because their will was not their own. Conscience is what separates the virtuous from the obedient. It is the inner guide that asks, before every act, whether it aligns with truth, with goodness, with what is just. A command may direct you to silence the innocent, to ignore suffering, to enforce laws that oppress rather than protect. In such cases, obedience is not nobly, it is dangerous. It allows wrongdoing to spread, masked by procedure and discipline. When people prioritize command over conscience, they participate in injustice while convincing themselves that they are upholding order. It is not disobedience that threatens the moral order, but blind obedience. The disobedient may err, but at least they err from conviction. The blindly obedient obey regardless of what is being asked. They can be led into any act so long as it is authorized. They become willing instruments in the hands of those with power, not because they're evil, but because they have silenced the part of themselves that questions. And when enough people do this, entire systems of cruelty are sustained by ordinary, obedient individuals. The conscience, unlike command, does not change with power. It remains constant, even when unpopular. It asks for courage, for responsibility, and for reflection. To follow conscience often means to disobey. It means standing apart, refusing what is legal but unjust, what is accepted but immoral. The obedient fear this path because it isolates them, exposes them, and challenges their comfort. But this fear is precisely why the obedient become dangerous, because it drives them to choose the security of submission over the difficulty of doing what is right. Obedience to command offers the illusion of safety. It protects individuals from blame in the eyes of the world. But in the eyes of conscience, it cannot absolve. Each person is accountable not only for what they do, but for why they do it. And when they abandon that responsibility, when they silence the voice within in favor of the voice above, they do not serve virtue, they serve power, often at the cost of justice. Blind followers turn into tools of destruction. They do not set out to do harm, yet their lack of awareness, reflection, and responsibility makes them capable of carrying out the very worst of deeds with calm and quiet hands. Obedience becomes dangerous when it is not tethered to conscience or reason. The blind follower does not ask questions, does not weigh consequences, and does not seek truth. They only act, believing that action under command is enough. But action without understanding, especially when multiplied across many obedient people, becomes a force that destroys rather than builds. Those who obey without question cease to be moral agents. They stop asking whether the actions they are ordered to perform are good, just, or necessary. In doing so, they lose their autonomy and become extensions of another's will. A blind follower is no longer an individual thinking for themselves, but a tool in the hands of power. And a tool, however innocent its shape, takes on the purpose of the one who wields it. In the hands of the unjust, the obedient become capable of enforcing policies that strip others of dignity, freedom, and life itself. This is the danger that lies in systems built on obedience. They create environments where evil can flourish behind the appearance of order. Atrocities are committed not by wild, rebellious masses, but by structured, well-organized individuals who carry out commands without ever asking why. The soldier who arrests the innocent, the officer who enforces unjust laws, the clerk who signs off on cruel decisions, all of them may consider themselves just doing their jobs. But their obedience fuels the machinery of oppression. The blind follower does not act out of malice, and that is precisely why they are so dangerous. They are difficult to oppose because they do not see themselves as enemies of justice. They believe they are maintaining peace, order, and duty. They rarely recognize their role in larger systems of harm. Their intentions may even feel noble to them, which adds another layer of protection around the damage they cause. They are hidden destroyers, masked by the appearance of loyalty and service. When individuals are trained to follow without thought, they can be directed toward any end. If the purpose is good, they may do good. But if the purpose is corrupt, their obedience becomes lethal. They will follow orders to silence dissent, to marginalize the weak, to commit violence, and not because they desire these outcomes, but because they have relinquished their moral judgment. They rely on others to decide what is right, and in doing so, become the carriers of decisions that should never have been made. True danger arises when entire societies reward this kind of blind obedience. When questioning is seen as disloyal, when doubt is punished, and when virtue is replaced by submission, the ground is laid for great wrongs to be done by ordinary hands. The obedient become agents of destruction not because they hate, but because they obey without seeing. They become dangerous precisely because they believe they are harmless. But history teaches again and again that the most efficient engines of injustice are not built from evil intentions, but from unquestioning loyalty.